Hi everyone, Reverend Caleb Rundell here, and this is your 5th video in our series on Methodist basics. Thanks for watching these 5 videos that have taken us through 5 Sundays in Lent. Our last 3 videos have all been about theology. And as a reminder, theology is the study of, you could say, everything as it relates to God, and how we understand God and what we believe or know or think about God. There is a theology of literally everything because we believe that God is connected to everything. Now, in our final video today, we are talking about something that chances are you have never heard talked about explicitly. Even if you have been in the Methodist Church your entire life, we're going to talk about something that is latent or background in our life as Methodists, but we never seem to talk about explicitly. And today's video is about Arminianism. Now, I'm obviously going to talk a lot about this, so if you're saying, what is that? Don't worry, that's the entire point of this video. And to help guide us, there are 6 things that I have to say about Arminianism to share with you to help us understand what this is, why it's important to our flavor of the church, and what it means for how we live our lives. All right, so 6 things. The first of the 6 things, a note on pronunciation. Now, I am never sure that I am saying this word, Arminianism, correct. And Arminianism is a flavor of theology that is part of our Methodist Church. So when I'm saying the word, I mean this word, Arminianism, the theology. It is not Armenian, as in related to the country Armenia, as in the culture, the language, ethnicity, the church, the people group, the country in the Caucasus known as Armenia. So I want to be explicit that I am not always sure I am distinguishing the pronunciation between Armenian, the theology, and Armenian, the country and the people and the culture. So my apologies that I'm never sure I'm saying this right. So just to be clear, in this entire video, I am always talking about the theology, not the people and the culture of the Armenian country, okay, or the Armenian people. This is about Arminianism, the theology. You can see how those words are very closely related, but have nothing to do with each other, which is cool. So just to make that clear on what we're talking about and what we're not talking about today. All right. Second thing, where does this word come from? So, as I said, Arminianism is a flavor or a group, a school, if you will, of theology. And it is named after the main articulator of it. And his name was Jacobus Arminius. And check out this dude's mad ruffle game. I feel like we've lost something in fashion that we don't have mad ruffle game like this anymore. But kudos to you, Jacobus Arminius. Jacobus Arminius was a Dutch theologian who lived between the years 1516 and 1609. Now, his real name was Jacob Hertzmanzoon. I'm probably not pronouncing it either. My apologies to everyone who knows how to pronounce Dutch names correctly. But it was the fashion at the time that scholars would adopt Latin versions of their name. And the Latin version of his name was Jacobus Arminius. We don't do that anymore either. We lost the ruffles. We lost everyone having Latin names. But that's all good. So Jacobus Arminius studied and taught theology at the university level in the Netherlands while he was alive. But, and this makes him different than some of the theologians from that time period, he was also a preacher and a pastor to churches. And that is something that sets him apart from other theologians of the Reformation. And Jacobus Arminius was a major writer that articulated a flavor, a group of theology that got attached to his name. And that's the last we're going to say on the person. You can read a lot more about him online, about his life, things around his upbringing and what was going on in the Netherlands at the time that influenced all that. But we're not going to get into that because that would be its own video just about him and his life. We're talking about the theology that his name got attached to. Okay, so that's the second thing. The third thing, where did Arminianism come from? What prompted Jacobus Arminius to articulate a theology so distinct from everything else going on in his context that it got his name attached to it? Okay, so Arminianism, its history is rooted in what we call soteriology, which is the study or beliefs around salvation, the question of who can be saved with eternal salvation from God through Jesus Christ and all that sort of stuff. Now, that could be its own series of videos, soteriology and salvation and what it is and isn't and what all the different flavors of the church believe around it, but we're not getting into that. But this question of who can be saved, who can experience salvation, drives the history and the distinction of Arminianism. In a very, very basic and brief overview, we'll say it this way, if that's okay. In the early stages of the Protestant Reformation, and to learn more about that, you can watch the church history video or lots of things around that. Most of the Protestant theologians at that time taught a theology, a soteriology, that only the certain elect could be saved, especially the flavor of the church known as the Reformed tradition. And the main theologian around that was a guy by the name of John Calvin, whose name also got attached to a theology called Calvinism. And Reformed theology and Calvinism taught that it was only certain people, known as the elect, who would or could experience salvation. Now, you can go to the Bible and find a handful of scriptures, even in the Gospels, where that term is used, where the writers or Jesus in the Gospels plant this seed that there are only some people who will experience the fullness and goodness of God for eternity. Okay. And the thing about that is, in that theology, there is not anything any one person can do or not do to be elect. It is predestined by God. It's not up to you. You're either elect or you're not. And there's nothing you can do to change that. Now, that stream of theology is very much still out there in different flavors of the church. There are still plenty of Calvinists and people who prescribe to that flavor of theology in the church today, and that's all good. We are not that. Now, Arminianism develops as a counter to Calvinism. Calvinism comes first, and in the Protestant Reformation, the Reformed tradition and Calvinism really take root in the Netherlands during the time of the Reformation. In the absence of what was the Roman Catholic Church, Calvinism and the Reformed tradition really take root. And it was in that environment that Jacobus Arminius articulated a different type of theology around salvation. Arminius believed that looking at both his experience and the scriptures, that anyone, literally anyone, can be saved and experience salvation. That God has already chosen, but that God has already chosen literally everyone. That the work of Jesus in life, death, and resurrection is for everyone. That God has chosen you, no matter who you are, and that you can also choose God. But you don't have to choose God because you have free will and agency. Now, this is a theological and a church debate that continues to this day. You can go on YouTube and find very recent videos of people making their case to either be Calvinist or Arminius and who's saved and who's not and the elect and what that means and all those sorts of things. So there is a brief overview of where Arminianism comes from. It has its roots in this question of who can be saved. And the Arminian answer to that is literally everyone. Okay, now, the fourth thing I want to talk about. How are we as Methodists Arminian as well? So this has to do with our founder, John Wesley, and you can learn more about him in the church history video if you want to learn more about him. In his ministry, John Wesley very much preached a gospel message where everyone could know God and experience God's salvation. Pretty much straight Arminianism. But here's the cool thing about this. Wesley really did not know that at the time. He did in his lifetime, but not when he first got going. Wesley is out there preaching this Arminian message that everyone can be saved. Everyone is loved and atoned for by God. But Wesley didn't know that that was called Arminianism. It's just what he believed in when he was preaching. Now, as the years go by and Wesley gets more famous, as his movement grows, he is told by others, hey, Wesley, you are Arminian. He looks into it for himself and says, yeah, I am 100% on board with that. And we know this because when Wesley starts the official Methodist magazine, he calls it the Arminian magazine, meaning that this idea of Arminianism was so important to John Wesley that the official publication that he himself helped put out for his movement had Arminianism as the official title in black and white on the paper. And so we as Methodists from our very beginning as a distinct flavor of the church have been Arminian to our core. All right. That was the fourth thing. The fifth thing, what does being Arminian mean for our flavor of the church? It means that we believe that Jesus is for everyone and that everyone and anyone can be for Jesus. And that if Jesus is for literally everyone ever, we believe that no culture, our language, our people, our nation, our race, our class, or anything like that has any distinct special place in what Jesus is up to. We also believe that because of this, part of our mission is to proclaim and live out the good news of Jesus so that everyone has that opportunity to know the story. Okay? Not that that's 100% on us, but we are invited by God to be a part of what God's doing. And we're going to hear more about that here in a bit. We also believe a lot in free will as a gift from God, as an expression of God's grace in our world and in our lives. And what this means is that we believe that we can make choices for ourselves. And this goes way beyond the question of salvation and who can be saved. Being Arminian actually becomes a part of how you look at life and how you live your life. And in that, we put a lot of emphasis on choices and agency, that we can make choices for ourselves, no matter what our consequences are. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. That's coming up. But that we make choices and that we then own the consequences of those choices, good or bad. But here's the thing. We also believe that our free will is set into our particular context. And that context, the world we live in, is a result of the free will choices that others have made collectively as our human family over the course of time. And we'll get more into what that looks like. We also believe in what we call agency. And that agency is a reflection of God's image, that God is a creator out there doing things, and that we, as made in God's image, also have the ability to do things and create. And what this means is that we can use our free will and our agency and see them as gifts from God that also come, as every blessing does, with an invitation and a calling to use them for good, for the ways of God. That we can go out into the world and affect positive change, that we can do good in the world. And our work as United Methodists is rooted in our connection to being Arminianism. To being Arminian, that is, that we can go out into the world and do good things, that we can make the world a better place through our choices and our agency. And we can also do harm to our world through our free will and agency. We see through history that if we want to wage war against each other, if we, through our free will and agency as peoples and governments and systems, choose to create and perpetuate and hold up systems of racism and poverty and exclusion, God will let us do that because we have free will and agency. When we decide that war is the best option, God will let us make that choice. And we then, as our human family, have to live through those heartbreaking consequences. So there's a plus side to being Arminian and how we believe that functions in the world, that we can do good. The flip side of that coin is that we also believe that God allows us to do bad, and that then all of us have to live with those consequences. Okay, so that was the fifth thing. The sixth thing, what does being Arminian mean for you as an individual as you live your life? Now, what that means is that free will and agency are a big part of how we live. And that may sound really simple, but what it means is that we don't put a lot of stock in ideas like destiny or fate or that things are set in stone are the stars. We believe that certainly that God is at work in our lives and in our world, but also through our free will and agency, we can choose to partner with God or not. We can say yes, no, not yet. We can respond in all sorts of ways to all sorts of things in our lives and also have that response to God as well. And we see that in scriptures, that there are several times throughout the stories of scriptures where people say no to God's invitation, are no to the ways of God. And what usually happens is God finds someone else that says yes. That God's like, all right, you have free will. You can do what you want. That's part of the design of humanity and creation. But because I'm God and I'm sovereign, I'm going to do what I need to do. And I might have to pick someone else to partner with me in that. And we see that throughout scriptures. Now, what this means for us is that we are called to live life with intention and mindfulness and being conscious of what we do and what we don't do. That we are called to be intentional about the choices we do and do not make. And we are also called to be aware that the world we live in is a product, for good or for bad, of the collective history of everyone's free will and agency through time. Now, in seeing the world like that, there is a comfort and there is also a challenge. The comfort is that you as an individual, me as an individual, we are not responsible for everything in the world. Your personal choices did not create poverty. My personal choices did not create racism. We are not responsible for the way the world is its entirety, because that is the result of choices and agency over the course of all of human history and how we interact with each other across time and space. And so there's comfort in that. And there's also comfort knowing that there are things that we can change. There are things that we can influence, that our agency does have an impact on the world, and that we can use that for good in whatever way works in your world. It may be in ways that you would say are small, but we know in the ways of God, the small is actually the big. You may be a person of power and privilege and influence. You can use those things for good or not. The choice is up to you. And that's the challenge that comes from this. There's a comfort in that you're not responsible for everything. But the challenge is that you are responsible for the things that you can influence, for the things you can do. You can make the world a better place. You can serve others. You can serve the ways of God and be a part of what God is doing in the ways that you can. You don't have to fix everything or understand everything. That's God's job, and we're not here to put God out of a job because we can't. But we can do the things we can do. Now, in this, we also experience and see our lives as individuals, as communities, as all of humanity, as the product of our choices and the choices others have made. And this compels us and invites us to learn more about ourselves, who we are, and our world, our history, our systems, our possibilities. Being Arminian can be seen as an invitation to continually learn more and grow as individuals, as communities, as the world. Because the more we learn and understand and the better we know ourselves and our world, the better we're going to use that free will and agency that God has given us as a great gift of grace. And so to be Arminian is to be on a journey of mindfulness, of learning more about God and yourself and growing in that knowledge. Okay, now that was the sixth thing. I have one more thing for you. So this has all been great, talking about some Dutch guy with lots of ruffles and all this talk about free will and agency and all that sort of thing. I want to put for you a story to why this matters and how this is important. Okay? So I'm going to share with you a personal story. And this gets into some deep stuff, but to be human is to go through some deep stuff. So if you have been through some deep stuff, this may be helpful for you. And I think it illustrates how being and understanding what it means to be Arminian helps us live our lives and be intentional and do what we can in our world. Okay, so this story comes from my life when I was a young person and I went to war. I was in the Army National Guard and got deployed to the streets of Baghdad from 2007 to 2008. And at that point in my life, I had been a person of faith, a follower of Jesus, for several years at that point. And this idea of going to war just, it sat with me and it troubled me because I want to be someone who follows the Prince of Peace, who says, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, who yells at Peter when he draws his sword and slices someone's ears off during Holy Week. This Jesus who says, enough of this. And war is all about control and violence and power and all these things that Jesus is very much not about. So this sat with me. War is also something that, as being human, makes you think about your own mortality. And I hope, don't want to burst anyone's bubbles, but your own mortality is something you should think about from time to time because it's coming whether you want it to or not. And as we talked about, it's always better to face things intentionally and with mindfulness than not. And there is one thing certain in life, and that is death. And so, I'm a young person, and like a lot of young people, you have thoughts that you're invincible and you can do anything, and you'll come through everything either without a scratch or in ways that can easily be fixed or healed. But war challenges that. And there's a lot of randomness to war. The physics of bullets and explosions, where you're at what time, can all feel very random. And that causes questions about what is God up to in all these things? What is my part in all these things? There's an old saying that I don't believe is true, but there may be some credence to it. And that saying is, there are no atheists in foxholes. And what's that getting at is that when we are confronted by things beyond our control, or what we perceive as beyond our control, we put a lot of weight onto God. And we can either give God a lot of credit for things when they go our way, or we can give God a lot of blame when they don't. And here's the real power in being Arminian, is that you see that no matter what happens, God is good. And that when good things happen, you praise God. And when bad things happen, you praise God. And you don't go looking to place blame upon God, because most of the things that happen in our world, we learn, are the results of our free will and agency, either as individuals and especially as humans. And what this meant for me when I was just 23 and young and dumb and just driving around the streets of Baghdad is that I was called to learn, like, how did this war come to be? Well, it's because politicians made choices. Who put those politicians in power? What system of politics was in place in the first that allowed all this to happen, that set these systems in place? And all those other resorts of choices that people have made over time. I even got into it and read this fascinating book about where even Iraq and other countries in the Middle East and Europe come from. And it's rooted in this story of European power and colonialism and an empire that comes out of World War I, of all things. The book is called Versailles 1919. It is a deep read, but it has a lot to say about the choices that people in power make that still shape our world today, here over 100 years later. And so, as just one person, I saw how my individual choices, like I had chosen to join the Army National Guard right before the war started. So that one's on me. Can't blame ignorance or fate or destiny on that one. I did that. But I could also see that what got me to making that choice has something to do with history and the culture that I come from. So that's part of it too, and that I'm not responsible that there was a war in the first place. That has to do with politics and histories and systems and empire and oil and all sorts of things, and I'm not responsible for that. But this showed me that there are things I was responsible for. For a while, I was in charge of 2 other soldiers. I'm responsible for them. I have the things that I have, and I'm responsible for what happens with those things. And so being Arminian and being Methodist helped me through this time to make sense of it, and mainly to understand my relationship to God as I was going through this experience. It also helped me see how broken our choices can make the world. Here's this country that was just kind of fabricated on the drawing rooms of Europe in 1919, and is suffering this great violence because of choices that have flowed from there since, and go back obviously further to that. You can talk about Saddam Hussein and all sorts of things about why Iraq was the way it was when I showed up in 2007. And you can see that that is a story of people exercising their free will and agency, sometimes really not for the best, and to the detriment of entire countries of people. And countering that, you can hear the gospel message that as we look at our world, and there is still plenty of war to go around, there's still plenty of violence and poverty and racism and homophobia and all of those things that we inflict upon each other. And you can see that that's the world that we have made. That's what we've done with our free will and agency. And instead, Jesus is there calling us to something better, more life-giving. We can see the world not as a result that God has abandoned us or that God has caused these things to happen, but we can see it as a stark contrast to the ways that Jesus calls us to. Instead of war, Jesus calls us to the way of peace. Instead of oppression and poverty, Jesus calls us to the way, to the systems where everyone has food to drink, or food to eat, safe water to drink, safe communities to thrive and grow in. And that's very different than the world that we, through our free will and agency, have created. And so, that's a little take on how Arminianism can impact your life as you live it as a person in the world. And so I want to say thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. You probably got some questions, and I want to invite those questions. We can chat over email. My email is here, pastor@fruitaumc.org. We can meet up if you're here in the area for coffee or beer or whatever and chat more about this, because this gets at some deep stuff, not just about our theology of the church, but in how we live our lives and how we interact with the world and how we see ourselves in the world. So I invite those questions. I want to invite those conversations. As hopefully it came across, I care a lot about being Arminian and what this means for our church and what this means for you and me and how we live our lives. So send your questions or conversation points my way. I look forward to receiving those, and let's talk some more. Again, thank you for watching. Feel free to dig into anything more on your own here in this last video where we've talked about being Arminian. All right, and one last thing, let's get that mad ruffle game up again. All right, so I want to say thanks to Jacobus Arminius for his mad ruffle game, and you take care. Hope whatever day you're watching this, you have a great rest of your day. God bless. Go out, be the person God has called you to be. Use your free will and agency to make the world a better place in the ways that Jesus teaches us. Take care, friends.